How are folks doing today? Is everybody starting to mentally check out for holiday season?
Oh, I have a few more days before I can do that, I think.
I figure a few more days, it's like last week of normal meetings, and the next week is going to be half attended. And then after that, it's just chaos until after the new
Yeah.
year.
hmm
So, Nathan, before we get started, I figure I'll ask any progress on the Container D side.
I just more or less need to do a final editing pass, so it'll be this afternoon probably. I guess the only thing interesting is that different from the other ones is Container D doesn't actually seem to do any parsing around the scopes. It just takes the scopes and puts them into a giant collection and then passes all of the scopes instead of trying to merge pushes and pulls and stuff into a single scope.
I was following you into that last second there. What was it about merging the scopes into a single?
So it just like if you have instead of taking like push and pull and merging, you have a pull scope and a push scope. Instead of kind of merging that into a single scope, it does two scopes.
Got it. Does it generate the scopes itself anywhere, or is it strictly following whatever scope it gets from the server?
It's all coming from the server.
Got it. And how does it handle, because Container D is long running,
Mhm.
it's staying persistent for a long while. Is it per client request that it sets up a new authentication? So a client connects in and says, hey, I'd like to pull this image, and then does the authentication just for that one request, or does it have some kind of persistence across those?
I haven't I haven't necessarily found that in the code, but I mean just kind of by experimentation, it's pretty much kind of per client request. So reuse the same scope over an entire pull or an entire push or something, but um, it tends to ask for a new token if you do two pulls in a row, even if they're the same thing.
Got it. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. Is there anything on the Container D side that gets more complicated than a push and a pull?
Uh, Not that I've really stumbled across, but I might not be the right
Yeah,
person to ask either. So
I'm thinking there isn't, and so that simplifies the use case a lot, and
yeah.
in a good way for Container D, and a bad way for us building a spec. But take the advantages that you can get.
hmm
So without that, we don't have any actual agenda item today. The stuff I was looking at before this meeting was a little bit of the RFCs out there just to kind of poke around at the authenticate header and the authorization header and seeing how those are handled. I think the other thing we were talking about last week was, do we want to start building up a list of all the hard questions we want to try to answer? So would that be a good use for our time today, or people have other ideas they'd like to focus on?
Yeah. Sounds good to me.
I was about to say, I'm taking the silence as everybody agreeing because you're not putting out any other ideas. So that's it. You're stuck with it. So I'm working the HackMD in case anybody doesn't have it. I'll drop this in the notes. And I guess I could also share, but need to move some windows around if I'm going to do that. For now, I'll just stick in the HackMD. So in here, I'm just going to kind of start thinking through some of the different scenarios I've thought of throughout your own as we're going. Feel free to interrupt. Definitely doesn't have to be just me talking. That gets boring. Nobody likes to hear that. Things I'm thinking of are, to start with, do we have any in our original proposal? I should look at that first. We're talking different types of access, push and pull, multiple repositories. We talked about cross repository. I'm just going to start sharing my screen because it's not fair for me to be saying this stuff and having nobody understand what the heck I'm reading. So, massive window move and sharing of the screen. So this was our original proposal back in the day. And pull up my participants, my chat messages in case people start saying stuff and I'm not paying attention. We talked about, I was kind of looking through some of this. And in here, we're talking about different methods, basic and bare. That's an easy one to cover. I don't know if we're going to get anything beyond those. Unauthenticated request, and so that's just the general. Are you going to allow anonymous without even a token? Are you going to send back the www authenticate header on those scenarios? Access to a repository, different types of access. So we were talking push versus pull. I saw delete the other day. We've got potential different other kinds of things for looking in the future in terms of other functionality we were looking at. I'm thinking through all the different extensions that we've been talking about adding to OCI. And so as we do that, does that make sense to start adding more granular access in here? We've got cross-repository blob mounts. Those are pretty straightforward in terms of need to support them. We've got, let's see, expired and insufficient authorization. This is where things start getting a little hairy, I think. I think this is where Containerd and a lot of other tools out there get away without worrying about this because they're not specifically, they don't have the long-lived request and they're not using the same token for multiple things. We've also got, let's see, expected lifetime. That's, if you're going to do long-lived, that's a bigger question. And let's see. Any future extensibility. So we talked about this fine-grained access control we need to worry about in the future. Still reading these as well. So as much of this, I think this is a good starting point, and then we can start to add more and more on top of this. I'm just going to copy this over into our notes, and then we can build on top of that as best we feel. How does that sound? This is what we started with. And we'll clean this up so we have a list. Normally, I'll try to find a way to automate this, but this list is not long enough for me to deal with that right now. Okay. So on top of these, I think some of the stuff we were talking about last week was if you do a pull and then a push. And from this, I want to query to see if this manifests there before I try to push a blob and the other content. How does that respond in the headers? How does the registry respond to that sort of scenario? I think that's a good one to make sure we're covering. And this week we are discussing scenarios. And the multi-repository we kind of covered in there to some degree. I think some of this, when we talk about a long-lived token, is where I get into a lot of trouble. And maybe the answer is we just don't. And just have
Yeah, I
scenarios
don't
you're
know. I
thinking
mean,
of.
it seems like, well, I guess it probably depends on kind of the status code you get back from an expired token as well. But it seems like a lot of the clients I've seen more or less would just kind of re-authenticate on expiration. But
I was looking a little bit of that. Sorry, that's doing funny stuff to the windows, just moving the Zoom stuff out of the way here. I was looking at, which one was it? I think it was OAuth. Or maybe not OpenID. Yeah, OAuth too. I feel like in here there was a comment that said, that was probably the error codes of saying, if you have insufficient scope, and the thing that got my attention was it said 403. And I thought, well, that's not so great. The 401 on an invalid token is good. And so if your token is expired, revoked, malformed, you're supposed to come back with a 401. But in the spec, if it detects an insufficient scope, the normal upstream thing in the OAuth 2 spec is to respond back with a 403. And that's where we get into trouble of, I've requested pull access to one repository, but now when I turn around and try to use that same token to a push, well, my token was only for pull access. The challenge here being that we're using scope in a much finer grain than I think a lot of other implementations do. I can also drop this link if anybody's curious to read this stuff. I'll leave that in the notes as well. Oh, thinking about I might have killed the discussion by pulling in all the working group proposals because we did so much back then.
Why is that particularly a problem that we want to authenticate for pull versus push or both?
If you do a pull followed by a push, I was getting ready to put that in the notes because I was almost going to create a new item here, and then it's not really a new item. You'll receive a token. And then on the push, does the registry know that you don't have push access? Does it know that you need to request a different scope, or does it come back and say your scope is insufficient, you're denied?
That's a good question. I've only seen it on the config side in the client that you're requesting a particular type. I haven't checked the actual auth to see if it was sending a token over defining the type.
So I guess my question is how
is that a repo option? Or? Sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to ask, like, how common a flow is pull and push in the first repo, or in the same repository? Is it a case that really needs to be optimized for? Because as I understand it right now, right, like you're going to attempt to pull unauthenticated. You're going to get a 403. You'll get a WW authenticate header. You'll go hit the token service using the hint there. Pull, that's successful. Then try to reuse the same token for push. Once again, you'll get 403, see that you need a different scope token, go hit the token service, and then push. Is it a super common flow that you are doing those two operations in the same repository, and that is extra round trips that
You
For
probably
me,
do
needs
it.
to
yes.
eliminate?
Yeah, I think you do a head usually on the manifest, and it's probably going, and this token or the server is going to tell you that you need a pull scope, so you go get a pull token and head
Okay,
succeed.
Before I pull the
so when we
blob,
say
I check to
pull,
see if
we're
it
even
exists.
okay, right. So because I'm thinking pull here, like actually transferring content, but we're not even transferring content. We might even just be doing a head on a tag or a get on a manifest,
Yeah,
and then not bothering with blobs. Yeah. Yeah, because that is a pull in the spec, but I'm thinking more conceptually of what end users think of as a pull versus what the HTTP traffic looks like in the API design. Fair
No,
enough.
And
yeah,
and
you
a
could even have
nit
an
on,
anonymous on the pull could be anonymous, right?
depending on the registry. A
Right.
nit on the status codes. The 401 is you're unauthorized. You need to go get a token, and here's the header to go get it. A 403 is forbidden. You are not allowed to talk to that request. Your token is insufficient. Go away. And so you only go through the authentication when you get the 401.
And I think where the tension happens with the spec here, with the OIDC spec here, is just that the spec is kind of built around this idea of the scope you have is insufficient. You can never see this resource go away. Whereas with us, it's your particular token may be insufficient. You may be able to access this resource. You got to go try the auth service and find out if it'll issue you a token. And like that is the inherent tension, is it's not that I know who you are and you absolutely will never have access to this resource, because it's actually this very narrowly scoped token you have happens to not have access to this resource.
I think the way a lot of people use the OIDC spec is they're logging into a website and they need to get a scope for 2 or 3 different major roles that they might have on the site. And those traverse across every request they make. And we're using it as a very fine grain. I'm trying to do this one action on this one repo. And the second you turn to another repo, it's a completely different request. And that doesn't fit so well with the way the OIDC spec is written.
I mean, it's hard. All the OIDC, but when it comes to single sign-on with a website, yes, it tends to be longer lived. This is the superset of everything you can access or going to need. The registry auth by definition is very minimally one-off scoped. This is the minimum access that you need for this. I think with regards to the specific 401 versus 403 thing, I think that's an implementation thing that we could do. I mean, essentially, the problem arises from the fact that for good or bad, I'll leave that to be decided. If you request something but don't get it, it was determined to, return back an NP token with a 200 OK versus kind of like a failure. Which means we can't really determine, hey, you asked for this and didn't get it versus you asked for this and did get it, or you asked for this and didn't get it versus you never asked for it at all. Yeah, if I ask for push permission on some private repo and I don't have access, then I just get back an empty token with nothing versus something comes back saying, yes, you flat out, or sorry, I'm confusing that. There's no way to tell whether you asked for something or whether you asked and didn't get it. And so I think we could change that and actually add a thing in the generated token of, hey, we have a access field within the generated token. If there was a denied field within the generated token, to differentiate, yes, you did ask for this, but it was rejected. The registry can then tell, hey, you never asked for this, and so you need to go ask for it, versus you asked for, you have asked for this and you didn't get it, therefore go away. This is a refusal. So if we were to include that sort of history of things you have asked for, the registry could differentiate that 401 versus 403.
So I'm
So,
gonna
so you mean like it
go ahead.
So you mean like enumerating negative scopes, enumerating the negative space explicitly in a token as opposed to letting it be implicit and only determined by the server side?
Yeah, correct. Because right now, the way it's defined, if you ask for 10 different scopes and you only grant access to 5 of them, we just return you back a token that says, here's the 5 you asked for. There's no way to know you asked for a different 5 and got rejected. And therefore, the registry doesn't know whether you never asked for it or whether you asked for it and were denied. So maintaining that sort of denied list as well allows the registry to differentiate.
So today the registry doesn't ask for it. I'm going to throw the open-ended question out there. Is this something we want the registry servers to do, or is this something we want the clients to do with the knowledge that they have on their request? And so if we pushed on the registry, I think we're in a scenario where it's not done today and it's a change for registries to implement that may not be trivial for everybody. But it follows the OAuth specs a lot closer. If we push it on the client, I think the clients have the information they need to do it today, and there are not a lot of clients do stupid stuff like I do. So it may be easier to implement without breaking existing infrastructure, but we're not following the OAuth specs as well.
I think there would be a way to add it if this was a net new optional field added to the token, as far as like a negative list. That could be done in such a way that would not break any existing things. It could be more of like an optional support. Hey, the registries can do this, provide maybe more clarification. I don't know. I think there could be a way to do it in a way that wouldn't break anything and kind of allow for graceful onboarding. But at the end of the day, yes, the client is always going to have more knowledge about what has been done and what needs to be done.
Yeah, the way I do it on my side right now is I keep track of all the scopes that I've been asked about. And if I don't get a new scope and I know my token hadn't expired, then I assume that I'm getting forbidden, even if it is a 401. And then I prematurely add new scopes into the list, working around the scenario where I think a lot of people have short-lived tokens. I have the long-lived token, but before I try to reuse it, I add a scope into there prematurely for a new area. And so that's where I kind of turn a long-lived token into a short-lived one, because I drop the token as soon as I change that scope. This might also be a case of us doing it on both sides, where we say registry should do the negative token, but also clients should keep track of what scopes they've been requesting. And if they see a new scope, then they know they need to do the authentication. If the scope is being reused from before, then maybe they're in a loop where they've already gotten there. Anyone else have thoughts on that, whether client versus server?
I think it's fair to have the clients with the negative config values, but I'm not so sure about the, tokens with a negative permission, or at least not in the Kubernetes sense, right? I guess it depends on the scope of the type of client and what you're doing. If you're doing, build development, that might make some sense there. But I haven't seen it being provided yet. If we're following OAuth, in OIDC, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? To introduce a new concept.
I'm thinking of from the Kubernetes side, you probably don't have the same concern on Kubernetes, since I'm assuming every pull of an image is going to be a new auth request for that one image.
Not necessarily. It could be for a set of images that are in the pod. I guess it would depend on the cloud configuration.
Fair point. Any other scenarios in here people are thinking of that we need to worry about or have opinions on how we should be trying to tackle some of these? I'll throw one out right now, which is, how should the scope look like for a cross-repository blob mount today? Assuming most people just defer that to the server. The server comes back and says you need to request this scope, but I'm assuming it will give
URL
you...
redirects, or well, what kind of stuff you're talking about here?
No, I'm not talking about URL redirects. That was a topic we mentioned last time, so I'm going to add that here as well. So we'll get over that in 1 second. Thanks for bringing that up, because I really forgot about that one. Cross-repository blob mount is when you try to pull your blob, you have the Alpine base image, and you do your build on top of that, and you just say copy all the Alpine layers from this repository to another repository instead of pushing them up yourself. So server-side copy.
I see.
In that scenario, you're going to request a token to do a push to your repository, but you might also need the pull token for the base image repository, assuming it's on the same registry. So do clients today try that, or do pretty much all clients just, if they do anything at all and not defer to the server, just request push access to the one target repository? Does anybody know off the top of their heads?
Not to my memory. I think it's administrated on the registries in the cases where it's done. We could probably get one of the Microsoft guys, if we don't already have one in here, to talk about how they've integrated with Docker. I believe they do cross-repository blob mounts.
I have to look into that. I think the way it's done now is fairly ugly. I'm not sure it's terribly consistent.
Okay.
This came up with a registry I shall not name. But where I'll look at the attendees and see if anybody's there to defend themselves, and they are not. So
I do believe the answer is yes. It does do a push to target and a pull from source, which creates problems because it does the same thing for cross registry blob mounts, and then you're trying to request pull access from a different registry and push access to this registry, which obviously it isn't doable, which always results in the mount being rejected. But then the registry there's a 201 or some code in there that the registry handles that either anyway, despite not having explicit access for it. But yeah, I do believe the actual request does go through as both the push to target and pull from source. But the auth is limited in what it can do at times.
Jeff, is that for Moby or for the container D? Which are you thinking of right now?
Was trying to think which tool did that. I think it might be Crane that was doing that, which under the covers. Is that container D under the covers, I think?
Crane should be the Go container registry.
Okay, so yeah, that might be that one that was doing that primarily.
Yeah, I know. The scenario I ran into was, I think I was putting both scopes in there. I was putting both the push and the pull, and I hit a registry that only wanted the pull. And if I tried to add both scopes into it, it just gave me access denied. Maybe it was just picking whichever the first scope was in the list, and I put the wrong one first. But I've seen that from a registry that I will not name. And it may have also, when I tried to upgrade from doing a pull or doing a push, may not have upgraded me correctly either. Good thing is that registry's going away, so that's a problem we might not have to face anywhere. I suspect a lot of the code out there, though, if I want to dig, I'm guessing a lot of it is just requesting the push access. I wouldn't be surprised to find that. But I want to do some digging before I commit to that too much. I know my own code requests both.
When you say push the target and pull from source, are you indicating here that it's the same registry with two tokens, or are you talking about just put two permissions to the same connection?
Two scopes to request for a single token. And so when I do my authentication request to the token server, I say I want both of these scopes. And it will come back and say, here's your token that has whatever it has in there, and I try to use that. Depending on the registry, a lot of them like that. But I think there are exceptions.
Well, I know we have the options and configure that way that when you make your connection for a registry, it's for both pull and push, but I'll have to check the code to validate that we don't just ask for push.
This one gets interesting because it's two separate repositories in a single request.
Ah, okay.
And so you're making one API request that says, copy this blob from the Alpine repository to my personal repository.
Yeah, so it is split. I got you.
And so you have to put one token in that request. And how does the registry keep track of, he has access to read from the Alpine repository?
But not push.
Depending on where you're pulling from, it could be a private repository of your own personal base image. And do you have access or not to read from that repo? All right, so that one, more research probably needed. Now for the one you brought up, Mike, which, thank you. That's why I like people to chat in this stuff, because I forget stuff. The URL redirect. I have not dug into this to see what happens under the covers because Go just does it all for me. But in this case, I think we're assuming that redirect should not include the authentication header in the redirect. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah, there should be an auth header there.
So without that auth header, the redirect of it needs some kind of authentication. We're assuming that now needs to get passed as a URL parameter in the redirect itself.
I think you
Or is
said
this-
you wrote no, or did I miss?
So I'm saying right here that the auth header, should the auth header exist in the redirect? And so should the client reuse the same auth header when it's talking from server A to server B? And I think the answer to that is no, we don't want to pass that around because that's a private token that shouldn't be given around. But when you are redirected to another server, in that redirect request itself, I think the redirect request is going to include any kind of special authentication you need to that CDN server, whatever it needs.
I mean, the implementations is generally you have the URL contains a signature in it, and then it also expires. I don't know that it generally has like authentication beyond that. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's some sort of fancy protocol for finding an auth token for some of these redirects.
Yeah, like it's just going to end up being like an auth token equals URL parameter at that point.
Yeah.
And that may be a completely different auth token that is just for that one request, or maybe just for some subset of request. But yeah, that is going to be a question for this specific thing of how should that authentication be passed. That may be a server-side concern we don't care about, as long as we know that it's just within the URL itself and the client just follows it. I think that's the important part for us to know, that the client just follows a URL and doesn't include the header.
Yeah. Although generally the client doesn't want to just blindly follow the URL, since it could be, depending on what the URL actually points to, it could be like you can see like server-side request forgeries and things like that, but that probably isn't a concern here or for this group.
I'm hoping a lot of this is going to end up being content addressable, and you're following it for a descriptor. So not only is it content addressable, but you know the size. So you're not going to get an excessive amount of content back above what you're expecting. And if the digest doesn't match, then you assume you got some bad data. It's not guaranteed, because you could be querying a tag and somebody could throw you somewhere else for a tag. All right, Mike, what stuff are you throwing in the chat here?
Just throwing a link to the existing container D code on the redirect with authorize, and I see it. It does actually have a header check on the on each redirect auth. I'd have to run it in trace mode.
I feel like container D was the exception to what I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, I wouldn't, in this particular case, I wouldn't mind if we had some restricting to go on here, right? Or
So yeah, what I've sorry, go ahead.
Or at least just change, define a spec that requests a change of the default, right? Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so what I've kind of seen from the authorizing container D is it basically has a host, a map of hosts to tokens. So that's probably checks the redirect host and then tries to find a token for it, and will attach it if it exists.
Yeah, it does. It does. I just found the code where it
Yeah.
checks if the header for the host is there in the reauth as it
Problem is
redirects.
we're dealing with whatever the R object is here, and I'm the request. And I'm assuming this request has a host. And so if the request itself tracks the host, then the authorize on that. I'm wondering if that is
I think will pull the host out, the new request in that
from the redirect.
func there. So I think, so I assume the REQ there is probably the redirect. So that would probably have a new host in it.
Right.
Yeah,
Which could
request
have a
would,
different
but
permission as well, right?
yeah,
Wait,
this
wait.
request would, this R, since it's shared, that's where I want to double, triple check, I guess. And that's either a trace of the code or maybe just set up a quick example and see what happens.
Yeah.
Credentials get spit out to your other server. All right, Mike, you had the last one. You have any more good ones here?
Oh man.
Or
More
we're all
ones in
quiet.
the
I think
context of what? What are you looking? What kind of gotchas are you looking for?
looking for other scenarios that we haven't thought of yet in terms of where we need to worry about authentication, what problems people are going to encounter with this stuff.
Mhm.
We don't have Sajay here this
You
time.
talked about expiration, right?
Yeah, I think that was up in our original from the working group. Yeah, expired insufficient. I mean, some of these we can, if we don't want to document they exist, we can start to document how they should be handled. I think the first one from an unauthenticated request, that's just the 401, go get your authentication. Do we want to handle anything beyond basic and bare from this working group?
I think if that's all that we've currently seen, I'd rather stop at documenting current behavior. And if it comes out that there's some other thing that we need to define and support, then let's do that as an add-on or a next version.
I like that.
But we do want to avoid specifications that would prevent the extensibility. I'm reading your. So if I wanted to come in with an SSL with quantum authentication, then I could do that, right? But yeah, we don't need that in basic bearer.
Man, he said the quantum word. I know the IBMer in this room. Yes.
I had to bring it up. We're pushing PRs against OpenSSL, so.
Oh, good times. What I will say
mostly
is,
I think we're looking for the ability to check if it's quantum safe more so than using quantum integration.
yeah. What I will say is that this is the phrasing is very deliberate, that we're going to avoid a specification that prevents future extensibility. And so in the header itself, it says my authentication type is basic and bare. There can always be another type defined afterwards. And so we're not preventing future extensibility by defining just the two. Because of the way that auth header works. It's part of the auth header where it's saying, I think I even had this up because I was looking at this earlier. When you get the header,
when you said basic, I presume that's OAuth basic.
Basic is actually the
I see it.
Yeah, basic is actually the simple base 64 encoded user : password as an HTTP header. Nothing fancy to it.
Oh God.
But you're sending this over an HTTPS session. So
yeah,
it is encrypted in the session.
So it is SSL, but is there a requirement on that to be self-signed or?
The basic, none of that. It's just an HTTP header that includes, here's my user and password. That's why it's basic. This goes back to very original HTTP days before any of this stuff was ever thought about in detail. And so you can have multiple headers in here. And so the example in the spec is saying, hey, someone can make a new auth that is the quantum super resistant auth that comes out later on. We're not saying that you can't make that. We're just saying the ones we're going to document in our spec right now is basic and bare.
Okay, I see.
And
Yep.
and likewise, like you could have a completely out of bounds system of just we use mutual TLS certificates, and it's completely above the HTTP layer to identify clients.
Yeah.
But that is how that's communicated out of band, what the scopes allowed to the certificates are, whatnot. Like that's all completely out of the realm of documented, standardized, but it's still possible. Like it's not a closed system, I guess, is really what Brandon's going for. It's just this is how you do these known things, and then anything past that is you design it yourself and worry about the interoperability yourself.
Yeah.
I see where you're headed. That's fine.
We'll get the minimum. This is how a client works with a server. And if you want to write a new client that works with a new server, go for it. And if you get a lot of buy-in on that, then we can even talk about standardizing in the future.
Okay. So we'll add more later. I got it. We're going to start with basic and bare. That's cool.
Yep. Let's see. Pull and push. Pull and push came from when I was looking at scopes earlier. When I was looking at the original scopes, I saw delete in some of the ORS stuff. And I don't think delete was, it was never any of the original Docker specs on some of this stuff. All we ever defined was pull and push. Do we want to even get into this? Or do we want to just push this off and say strictly leave it up to the server?
A reference to some document that already describes this will be fine.
I think the challenge of the documents that already describe it is a lot of those have been getting pulled away and just redirected to distribution, which I don't know.
Notice I said that without saying distribution.
Yeah, the Docker docs I hesitate to link to anything on the Docker website because things move over there. Not that I don't like Docker. I like Docker, but the documentation pages, those URLs go bad on me after a while.
I think they were recently updated to just include links to point to the GitHub repo now. So
they were.
And I don't think those docs ever included a full list of kind of all the scopes. I think the only reason that pull and push are there is because they were called out in an example. At least the last time I read them. I'm not sure anything ever said like, hey, this is the full comprehensive list of potential actions of sorts.
There used to be, and I'd have to go dig to see if that got pulled over to the distribution and whether I had to go back in like an older version of distribution even to find it. There used to be a full rundown of the bare auth back and forth, and it defined client-side definition of the scopes in that document, which is the thing we're trying to get away from.
Right. Okay. I mean, there are endpoints on the registry that are specific for deletes. If we didn't add delete on here, what would the expectation be that like a push would also cover a delete use case? I feel like it's going to have to be necessary, if that's kind of like an optional support.
Yeah, if the client is the one that is generating that is what I was doing myself. And I think ORS is the one that said, oh, hey, we're going to support this. We're going to include the delete. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had talked to a registry that said, yes, that's what we're going to do over here.
Yeah, that would require us to add a link to something beyond just distribution, right? If you wanted to add delete.
So I think what Jeff was saying is that there are APIs for delete.
Oh yeah.
And so
in a different API than.
Yeah, the API already exists to do that. we don't have a specific action defined for that, but for us to define that action is also us defining what the actions are. And us defining what the actions are is implying that clients are doing this stuff. So I'm really on the fence on this one and how far I want to go down that. I kind of want to define it as a fallback, not as a preferred method, but as a client. Servers should send the headers like this because clients will assume they're going to generate them like this if they're an old client.
It's definitely a tricky question, because if I'm using certain registries, I can delete the entire repository, right? Which would delete all of the images and tags in that same. It depends on the API, right? What it means to delete.
So OCI, I don't think has that. The registry itself might, but OCI only lets you
Yeah.
delete blobs and manifest.
You can't delete a repository, and even what a repository, like lots of registries have higher order concepts above OCI, like namespaces with hierarchical access that can be created or deleted, or having a
Yeah.
namespace that actually is a pull-through cache to content somewhere else and stuff like there's lots of things above OCI. Even repository on the OCI side, I think, is really maybe was the wrong name in the end. Like maybe the name namespace should have been used or something, because people tend to think that the distribution spec defines more than it really does.
Oh yeah, we left namespace out on purpose.
Oh, but what I mean is that like a repository is just kind of a namespace for content at some URL in the registry, but the name repository makes people think that it's a little more definite in the distribution spec. And
Yeah.
namespace is similarly overloaded, right? But it is just that distribution's only concerned with how you transfer the content and not really any other management of it. And people end up looking to it as this is the registry API, when in fact, it is a subset of registry operations.
I've definitely encountered some users that said they wanted to delete an entire repository, and I had to come back to them and say, nope, that's not part of the spec. Sorry. They were sad. Meanwhile, we get some registries that say we don't want to enable the blob delete API at all. And I sympathize with that desire. All right. Thanks, Bjorn. Let's see on this. Multi-repositories for action. The cross-repository blob mount was one of them. I also see that one's the worst because it's a single API. But I also worry about if you have a client that is doing a copy from one repository to another, you end up in a scenario where two different requests are happening, one to push, one to pull for like manifest and whatnot. So that's going to be either two separate auths and two separate tokens for each of those requests, or you might be able to merge that into one auth token that knows both of those scopes and whatnot merged together. Depends on the tool of how that would work. I'm not sure if we want to, how much we want to specify that you can reuse that token when you're talking to multiple repositories. And let's see. Expired and insufficient authorization. I think a lot of us have copied the same code on this one a whole bunch. And the code assumes there's a minimum time that a token is to be valid. And there's also a generation time on that token. And so if you see something that was generated too far outside of your current time, I think if the token was already expired and you trying to generate or to set the time so that it was not expired with a minimum lifetime is still expired, it also changes the token generation time to be the current time, just to eliminate issues where you have a different time zone, or the server clock and the client clock are so far out of sync they just don't work together.
Should the expiration time be provided during the process of authentication? Some kind of a header?
Yeah.
Or
It is part of the response.
for example, I do a pull.
Yeah, it is part of the response. Here we go.
Nice.
You've got the refresh token. It says it's going to expire in a certain amount of time. There
Are they talking about the token expiring, or are they talking about the image?
the token expiring. And
yeah, I guess my question was in the context of how long is this, the copy of this image on your host, how long should that be considered, inviolate or
that's how we
accessible
don't define it.
For the login?
So this is a response in the OAuth documentation.
Well, let's at least consider it. I've got a use case.
Yeah.
I've probably talked to you about the use case in the past, Brandon, where we pull an image for user A in Kubernetes, and then later on, even if that image required authentication, we can then use that image because it's already in the cache for user B, and user B doesn't necessarily have access to the registry where it was pulled from originally. We consider that a security violation, and we'd like to fix that somehow. So what we're doing is we're adding ensure secret pulled images inside of Kubernetes, and we're going to do our own exploration based on a configuration, basically over a couple of hours. So you could create a few pods, but if pod B under user B doesn't have the token, doesn't have authentication, then has not been authenticated against that registry, then we're not going to allow it. And even user A, even if he got authorization, we're going to assume this registry may have pulled his authorization to use that image. And the reason I'm asking this question is we're not just using images, right? We're using secure data. Some of these container images are mounted and actually are data images or data layer, have large data layers with private information, I guess you could say, in them. So I think that's a pattern I'd like to see us at least consider for recommendation.
Yeah, the stuff we're looking at here is just the token. I'm trying to think of for that one.
Yeah.
For how we could solve that.
I mean, we literally could say, for this user, this token is only valid for this long length of time, and you'd have to re-auth. It would be an aggressive, garbage collection of the cache, if you will, right? But we could certainly do it that way.
Mm-hmm. For the token, I know that we said expires in, I think was the one we had. Yeah, we had expires in. We have added as part of our response. And maybe it's just newer version. I need to go dig it up because I was just looking at that just today and I haven't gone to dig up other RFCs. We have an issued at header. And so the server itself says, I'd issue this at this exact timestamp. And so if that time is different from your current time, by how much is it different? How long do you keep this thing around?
Yeah, that at least gives me a way to configure that on the client where we could take that issued at field and keep it in metadata.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, maybe
this is for the token. I don't know how much that's going to help you for your scenario though. The token might expire, but the image itself, that might be a whole different thing. Good question though. I think it's something to still keep in consideration. That might be for the bigger chat though, instead of this one, because I think the image itself is going to outlive the poll.
Yeah, and there's two contexts for that, right? One context is for a snapshot for an actual container, that you're running on that image, and the other is the context of another container 6 months from now if it's still in the cache, right?
Yep. Yep.
You get the idea.
Yep.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about that pattern in that.
Yeah, I think let's do that on Thursday meeting, because I think that's a bigger question than what we're trying to get into here.
Okay.
All right. On that note, we just ran a full hour with zero agenda, as always. We're famous for doing that. So thanks everybody for joining in. And for those who see you on Thursday, look forward to seeing you then. I'm expecting a light attendance next week because it's Thanksgiving week and people are probably starting to drop off, but I will, I'll still be here for that. So if anybody wants to join in, feel free to come and hang out next week too. Till
Cool.
then, see y'all
Hey,
later.
Brandon, wait, hold on for a minute. Do you
Yeah.
want to stick around and talk a little bit about that Thursday content?
Let's do that, but let's drop off of here and pull up a second chat just because I don't want to.
Yeah.
I want to be able to pull the recording up and post that on YouTube.
Gotcha. All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.